Moore's Law. Gordon Moore was one of the founders of Intel, the very successful chip maker. And Moore's Law is famous because it has been eerily prophetic and has been for a long time. In 1965, in an academic paper, Gordon Moore predicted that computer processing power would double every 2 years. Now, that said, it doesn't come in at exactly double over every 2 year period, especially in recent years. It's varied somewhat. But as a central tendency, it is certainly more right than wrong. Now, because of compounding, computer processing speed is just unimaginably faster than it was in 1965, 33 million times faster in 2019 than way back in 1965. Before we get too far in this chapter, I guess we have to define the internet. Oh, we're all on it. We can all give examples of it. But can you really define what it is? Well, according to Ralph Hansen, it is a mass medium. It incorporates elements of interpersonal, group, and mass communication. And here is a quote directly from his text. That's why it's got quote marks on it. So think about it. It is a diverse set of independent networks. It is certainly not centralized. It is interlinked, however, so that it gives the illusion of a single uniform network. One of the things that makes the internet possible is packet switching. And packet switching goes back farther than Moore's Law. In 1964, Paul Barron, working for the Air Force, developed a decentralized computer network. And in order to send messages over that network, they were broken into small data packets, which could be sent independently across the network and reassembled at the other end. Before there was the internet, there was ARPANet. And you may ask, what is ARPA? Well, that stands for the Advanced Research Projects Agency. That was out of the Pentagon. So ARPANet was military. And the real breakthrough with ARPANet was that it was able to network not just terminals that were clones of each other, but normally incompatible computers that were in various places. And this all started way back in 1969, the year of the moon landing. Please note that ARPANet at its infancy wasn't just an American invention. It was definitely a Western invention and largely a Californian invention. 3 out of the 4 original nodes, in fact, were in California. ARPANet very soon was given over for academic use. Tim Berners-Lee is a name you probably don't know, but you know his work very well. As with a lot of people who come up with really spectacular answers, they start by asking a really good question. Tim Berners-Lee asked, wouldn't it be a good idea to share documents on computers anywhere in the world? What kind of software could do that if the computers were somehow wired together over the internet? The answer was the World Wide Web and the first web browser, which Tim Berners-Lee gave away for free. Let's think about how the experience of being online has changed down through the years. I was online in the 1980s, and it was a very different experience than today. Your computer probably had a separate modem. The modem was clipped into your phone line, you would call a phone number, and if that phone number was far away, you got charged for a toll call. By the 1990s and the early 2000s, more people had broadband or they had DSL. Some folks were beginning to be liberated from cables. They had Wi-Fi. Well, where we are now, at least as of 2018, is that nearly 9 out of 10 American adults are on the internet. A little over 2/3 are on mobile devices. By the 2000s, when we had broadband in our home, there was a lot of talk about the internet being always on, 24/7. Whenever you wanted to search for something, you could go to your desktop computer and, there you were. But now, with internet through mobile devices, we have anytime, anywhere internet, which has certainly been a communications revolution all of its own. Citizen journalism. Especially in today's fast-moving world, and especially with the cutbacks in journalistic staffs, citizen journalists are our eyes and ears at the scene of all sorts of momentous events. A citizen journalist can be a blogger who is covering neighborhood topics. A citizen journalist can be someone who shoots cell phone video when they are at the scene of something that is newsworthy. Sometimes video shot by citizen journalists can wind up in the mainstream media, on television, or maybe screen grabs can wind up in the newspaper. Let's talk about social media, and I am hoping that you will be able to give me your answers in the chat box. So here's the question. Once upon a time, your parents were your age. I assume that they didn't have social media, and I assume that you do. So how is your life different than your parents' lives when they were your age because you have social media and they didn't? I'd like to hear your thoughts. Well, we all experience social media, but I'm not sure we really think about what's unique about it. From a business standpoint, social media is just a remarkable business model. I mean, think about a huge social media platform just brimming with an immense amount of content that the social media company does not have to pay for. I mean, think about that versus, say, the CBS television network, where they run carefully crafted, very expensive to make shows. Or think about the Los Angeles Times, which has a newsroom full of writers, photographers, and editors, and whatever they can't cover, well, they're getting other coverage from the wire services and freelancers. It's very expensive to put out a newspaper or run a TV network. But a social media platform, your users populate your site with content for free. Another characteristic of social media is how robust feedback is. That oftentimes the comments on a post are far more enlightening than the post itself. Another characteristic of social media is tagging. Again, linking people to the post, linking people to the photo, sometimes without their permission. Sharing posts is another characteristic of social media. The idea that a meme or something could go viral. And then finally, a characteristic of social media is that everyone can have their own little social media page that's completely different than anyone else's page. It is very, very customizable. Some years ago, we talked in class about whether video games are a form of mass communication. Well, I think that debate has been put to rest. Video games are a form of mass communication. Ralph Hansen enumerates some of the ways that video games are mass communication. For one thing, video game consoles are mass media consoles. They deliver content beyond games. Video games are mass communication because they are a venue, a location for mass advertising. Those are certainly mass messages. Some years ago, in a summer school class, I took students to the Hollywood Bowl, where we saw a concert completely of video game music. And I remember even back then, it probably would have been around 2012 or so. Even back then, the economics of the video game industry were touted as being comparable to the movie industry. Video games get First Amendment protection. Because after all, a video game is a message, isn't it? A video game is a form of speech. And so therefore, it is entitled to First Amendment protection. And then, video games have certainly become a spectator sport on Twitch and other sites. People playing video games before mass audiences. Online media is maybe a more democratic version of Gutenberg's printing press. When Johann Gutenberg created his printing press with movable type and started the mass production of the written word, I think the essence of the machine itself meant that a relatively few people were destined to ever have their own printing press and the power that came with it. But online media is different. It gives everyone the opportunity to be a publisher. My YouTube channel, which cost me nothing, I could certainly be more sophisticated at it, but I can get basic messages out there to you for free, I might add. In a way, I'm a publisher. Same thing with the Club Media Note blog. I did a rather sad media note around 2017. It was that the Encyclopedia Britannica, which had been in continuous publication since the late 18th century, was set to publish its last annual edition of hardcover paper volumes of the encyclopedia. It was a tacit admission that the new heavyweight champion of the encyclopedia world was Wikipedia, a very comprehensive, online, free encyclopedia that anybody can contribute to. It is a huge monument to the efficacy, the effectiveness of crowdsourcing. Years ago, I used to tell my students about zines, Z-I-N-E-S. Zines were little handmade magazines. And the people behind zines were usually teenagers and young adults, more often female than male. And the appeal of zines was that it was the one place where a person could put her own thoughts, her own drawings, her own poetry. And zines were not printed, they were photocopied. Usually they were not produced in the thousands, but the dozens. And people would send them out or hand them out to their friends. Well, there are probably still a few zines around today, but a lot of them have been replaced by blogs. And blogs are a very fine vehicle of self-expression. So I think what I'm talking about on this slide is that the internet is empowering. I guess a little bit to the rich and famous who can have their Twitter accounts and somehow gather millions of followers. But I think what I'm talking about more is just regular folks like us who really wouldn't have had much of a voice in the world of media. So tell me, through the chat box, how does the internet empower you? The hacker ethic. Here's a quote from Ralph Hanson's text. Hackers believe that access to computers should be unlimited and total. This was an early slogan, I would say 20 years ago in the internet era. Information wants to be free. As a group, hackers tend to be anti-authority. They tend to be against centralized power. They are not particularly impressed by position or credentials. Now, hacker is kind of a loaded word, but I can imagine some good things that hackers do for us, and I can imagine some bad things that they do to us. So tell me through the chat box, on balance, do you see hackers as good for the rest of us or bad for the rest of us, and why? Hacking the 2016 election. What I'm going to present on the next several slides is what Ralph Hanson has in his chapter. And this is based on the best evidence of what he believes to be true. Let me say a little bit about the graphic that you see on this slide. This is the Electoral College map. Please note that the size of the states are distorted. The states appear not in terms of their geographic size, but in terms of their size in electoral votes. Now, in the case of California, we are just slightly oversized. We are, by square mileage, a large state, but our population is even larger. I guess on average, we have a little more population density. But look at something like, well, Alaska. We know that it's a huge state geographically, but in terms of electoral votes, not so much. Well, let's get to hacking in the 2016 election. Mr. Trump either won a brilliant victory or a really lucky victory or something else. He won in the Electoral College because he got narrow victories in 3 normally Democratic-leaning states. He won by just a bit in Michigan, and a bit in Pennsylvania, and a bit in Wisconsin. A swing of 80,000 votes, all 3 of those states would have gone the other way. But they went for Mr. Trump, even though Hillary Clinton won the popular vote by about 2.9 million. There was at least some foreign involvement in the 2016 election. There was a Russian digital propaganda company that created fake social media accounts that were designed to make our internal divisions that are already there in the United States to make them even angrier, to make reasoned discussion even more impossible. We also know that there were Russian news organizations that were spreading false news stories on social media, sometimes through messages, sometimes through ads. Twitter has banned some of those organizations. Also, there is strong evidence that Russian hackers broke into Democratic National Committee computer networks and stole thousands of documents. This is a little bit like the break-in of Democratic National Committee headquarters in the early 1970s. You may have heard of the Watergate burglary, except in this case, it was virtual and not actual burglars. Those documents that were stolen from Democratic National Committee headquarters were eventually released, liberated, set free, whatever your terminology would be, through WikiLeaks and other online channels. It is known that Russian hackers broke into voter registration systems in 39 states, including in California. And there were attempts to modify voter registration records. However, there is no evidence that they were actually successful in changing votes. With the 2020 election looming, besides coronavirus, besides our highly polarized politics, dealing with foreign meddling is going to be a huge problem looming over the 2020 election. Cyberspace. The term is taken from the word cybernetics. It's the science of communication and control theory. It was a term that was originally coined by William Gibson, who authored a story in Omni magazine. Gibson, a prolific writer, also coined the term cyberpunk, that style of writing in movies that deals with the blurring of lines between humans and computers. Now, on the last slide for this chapter, I typically throw it open for a lot of commentary from students. So get those fingers going. I think that there would be some good discussion in the chat box over some of these issues. Internet issues. Crime. Whenever there is a transformative new technology that comes into society, whether we're talking about the automobile a little over 100 years ago, which brought about drunk driving, car theft, drive-by shootings, etc., certainly the internet has made old crimes doable on a larger scale, or more anonymously, or more effectively. Well, tell me in the chat box, what do you think are some of the crimes that the internet is fueling? The digital divide is a social issue. It is rooted in the idea that prosperous middle-class people have access to pretty much all the internet that they want on devices that are pretty much state-of-the-art. People who are struggling a little bit more financially, perhaps working class people, they may not have the latest and greatest in internet access, but at least they've got something. And then when we get to people who are truly in the lower economic rungs of society, they may not have any internet access in the home at all. And the question behind the digital divide is, does it make a difference? Does the fact that one child may grow up in a household with robust internet access, and a second child grow up in a house with very little internet access. How much does that play out on how well those children will do in school and in their adult lives? Technorot is the term that is given to the idea that if a person really gets into their online lifestyle, I mean, they are the sort of person who are, on the internet a vast amount of time. Does that cause other things in their lives to suffer? Does their physicality suffer? Do their social interactions and social skills suffer? In some cases, even does their hygiene suffer? That's the question that is posed by Technorot. Internet addiction. Internet addiction is not a physical addiction. It's not like heroin, but it is a powerful psychological addiction. And we know that psychological addictions can be very debilitating. Think about people who are compulsive gamblers, or think about people with eating disorders. Finally, the internet is perhaps the greatest rumor mill that the world has ever devised. And I would imagine that as you are hearing this, as we are working our way through this coronavirus crisis, that there are probably some doozies, rumors about coronavirus. Anyhow, hit the chat box to tell me what are some of the more remarkable internet rumors that you have heard. This ends Chapter 10.